Okay, so any questions before we start with the text? All right, so we started this chapter last time, the yoga of meditation. So this chapter is the culmination of the previous, really 3 chapters. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 describe a flow of thought in terms of describing the human development. Through karma yoga, you achieve renunciation. Once you get to a state of renunciation, then you're prepared for meditation, which is what chapter 6 is now all about. And so it's interesting, the first thing that we covered, the first verse that he talks about, when he starts to discuss meditation, he says, he who does his bounden duty without depending upon the fruit of action. He is a sannyasi. He is a yogi, not the one without fire and not the one without action. So the first thing he talks about when he comes to discussing meditation is having an ideal, acting on your obligations without depending upon the fruit of action. So he doesn't start with meditation itself. He starts with the essential prerequisite, which is that you must be established in yoga, established in sannyasa, through performance of obligations without any interest in the result. So this is sort of where what we started with last time, and there's a few more things that we covered into there. So 2, 3, 4, he was basically talking about that state. So in 4, for example, he says, not attached to sense objects, renounced all thoughts. So again, he's giving the state of someone who is prepared for meditation. So in 5, he says, let man lift himself by himself. Let him not lower himself. His self alone is his friend. His self alone is his enemy. So now again, he hasn't started talking about meditation yet. Now he's still talking about that path of spiritual development. And he says here, let man lift himself by himself. So one of the points that he's talking about here, he says, his self alone is his friend, his self alone is his enemy. So self here, you'll see in the text, it's lowercase. Right? So it refers to his own personality, what we generally think of as the mind. So it's the self in you that is lowercase self. There's the self in you that is your friend or your enemy when it comes to your own spiritual evolution. One of the ways that he talks about this in the commentary is to say that our growth is completely independent of circumstances. Our level of development, the way that we move, whether it's evolutionary or devolutionary, is not a function of circumstances. It's not a function of what's going on around us. It's only a function of how we choose to relate to that. Right? So the only thing within the domain of our control, within our sphere of influence, is the way that we are choosing to relate to the incoming world. Right? To an extent, we're helpless. Whatever your vasanas are, they will helplessly express. To that extent, there's a bondage, but there's also a degree of freedom that we have. Whether or not we choose to identify with the higher, or whether we choose to allow ourselves to be led by ego and egocentric demands. So this is what he says. It's yourself that is your friend, that is yourself that is your enemy. Who is it that, when they're faced with challenges, tries to keep their intellect fixed on the ideal, tries to keep their mind aloft in feelings of gratitude? It's you. You do that. Who is it that reacts to troubling circumstances with, anger and revenge? It's you. Your own personality does that. So your personality is your friend and your enemy. Right? And this is illustrated by the entire allegory of the Gita. You've got the Kauravas and the Pandavas. The Kauravas are the bad guys. The Pandavas are the good guys. So they represent, respectively, your lower and higher natures. So he says, in the introduction to the text, you must use your higher nature to overcome, to conquer your lower nature. This is the way to growth. And again, the word overcome, conquer, these words that are being used, they're relevant because of the context. It's a battlefield. And so he uses that kind of language. I think we mentioned this before. If the context of the story was that, a seeker went to a master and the master happened to be a gardener, then he wouldn't use language like, conquer and fight an enemy and kill and slay. It'd be, plant positive seeds and weed your personality of its negative traits. It'd be a different sort of language. But the language that he uses here is very forceful, very powerful because of the circumstances. It also illustrates the intensity of focus and the intensity of commitment that we need on this path. We were covering in the last couple of verses this idea of shraddha, a dedicated pursuit of truth. So that powerful language also indicates the sort of inner intensity that he's trying to convey is necessary to step onto this path. And so this is why he says, from the VT he talks about this in the three conditions of the mind. You've got an unstable mind, and you've got a stable mind. You've got restless in between. But an unstable mind creates misery. If your mind is unstable, then you'll be miserable. If your mind is stable, then you'll be happy. So your enemy is the one who wishes you harm and wants you to be miserable. Your friend is one who wishes you well and wants you to be happy. So this is the analogy that he's drawing here. When your mind is agitated, it's your enemy because it makes you miserable. When your mind is peaceful and stable, it makes you happy. It's your friend. And so let a man lift himself by himself. So it's the idea that we keep coming back to, is that the only thing that advances the goal of self-development is your own effort. You can put all of the other supports around yourself. You can read the books, you can attend lectures, you can do study, you can do your bhakti practice, you can work, and you can do all of these things, but none of them per se guarantees that there's going to be that consistent personal effort to advance the goal. You can perform all of these activities without there being that consistent effort towards the goal that has been set. I've heard Swamiji say a number of times, you can study the Gita and it be a purely mundane affair. You can study the Gita, there's no subtle intellect whatsoever. There's no thought of self-development. It's just an interesting text, and I want to learn about it, and I want to know it, and I want to be able to talk about it. So nothing that we do is a guarantee except for our own independent effort, that conscious thought force that we're putting in towards the ideal. So it's a consistency of thought. It is something of a paradox if you think about, you're told to maintain consistency of thought towards your ideal, but how am I supposed to do that and at the same time fully engage with all of my obligations in the world, the relationships I have and the activities that I need to perform, so on and so forth. So the ability to do both is what we call objectivity. So I'll look at it in two ways. So the first definition of objectivity, which is relevant here, is in the text governing business and relationships. He describes objectivity in this way. He says, every individual has multiple roles. So you take your own life. You're a father, you're a son, you're a brother, you're a colleague, you're a boss, you're a citizen, you're a whatever, So at any given time, you're occupying one of those roles predominantly. So when you're at your workplace, you're the boss. You're telling people what to do, you're giving strategy, you're taking advice, and all the rest of it. You're doing the activities of the boss. But you don't stop being a husband and father. And so you never lose the recognition that you're also a husband and father, but that knowledge does not come in and impinge upon your activities as a boss. You know it, but it doesn't stop you from being a boss. And so what it means is, if 10 p.m. rolls around, okay, let's make it earlier. Let's say 7 p.m. rolls around, and look, this has got to get finished off. I'm not going to be home for another 2 or 3 hours. I'll just call home and tell them. That indicates that you're still aware. I'm a husband and father, so I've got obligations there. So I've got to perform the obligation of letting them know I'm going to be late. But it doesn't stop you from performing the action in the present as at your workplace. And so in the same sort of way, while you're going through all of your obligations, you never forget you're also a seeker. Yes, I'm a boss, a husband, a father, a son, etc., etc. I'm also a seeker. What that means is I never lose sight of the fact that I'm also a seeker, which means I have to pay a little attention to that ideal, whatever that ideal is. So you have an ideal for your life, you never lose sight of that. Now, what's the quality or the nature of that thought? That's where we use that analogy, the bus leaves at 6. You familiar with that one? No? Okay, so you're on holiday in a foreign country, and the hotel has a shuttle service to a local tourist destination 2 or 3 hours away. So at 6 a.m. you get on the bus and you're reading the brochure, and there's museums and parks and beaches and stores and markets and everything else. You get off the bus once it arrives at the destination, and as you're filing off, the tour operator says, remember, the bus leaves from here back to the hotel at 6 p.m. Fine. While you're at the museum, while you're going for a walk, while you're at the beach, while you're in the market, while you're in the theatre, what's the one thing you never forget?
The bus.
Bus leaves at 6. Now, you don't force yourself to think about it. The bus leaves at 6. You're not dragging this thought into your attention and trying to make sure you hold on to it. If you did that, then you couldn't enjoy anything that's around you. You enjoy everything that's around you. But there's just a little thread of your psychological bandwidth being spent on the bus leaves at 6. And so this, again, is the way that our ideal occupies our attention. We are constantly just throwing a line, a thread of attention out to that ideal in a gentle background way, so that we never lose sight of it, but also so that it never impinges upon our other activities and our other obligations. So that as you maintain that ideal, what happens is that your actions will be informed by that ideal. You occupy that platform, as it were, and that's the basis or the perspective from which you make your choices. So to go back to the analogy, you look at your watch and it's 4 p.m. and you're in front of a theatre. The play's about to start at 4:30. It goes for 2 hours. No, thank you. I'd love to, but I can't, because it doesn't fit in with my ideal of getting back to the hotel. And so the choices that you make will now be governed or determined by the ideal that you have. And so this is an analogy, but when it comes to the actual practice, if you have an ideal of self-development, we understand self-development means the reduction of egocentric desires and attachments. That's our basic definition of self-development: reducing attachments, functioning less on ego, not taking so much. All these sorts of ideas. So if we maintain that as an ideal, then when something happens in our environment, naturally we're more inclined to act in line with the ideal because we're maintaining it. And the more we think and act from that perspective of less ego, as you think, so you become. You naturally become it. It becomes second nature for you to act without ego, or with less ego, less ego, less ego. It becomes something that becomes natural for you.